For the most part, what I'm going to look at today, certainly the first two-thirds, is actually looking at things that have not previously appeared on SSA. Occasionally, one or two of these subjects have been perhaps touched upon sporadically in individual surveys, but I think we can probably claim to be one of the first surveys to look at some of these issues particularly hard. What in a sense partly stimulates this is thinking a little bit about what are some of the key themes that between them the two sides are focusing on in the campaign. One is indeed the question about whether or not Scotland should have the right to govern itself. Therefore, if you feel Scotland should have the right to govern itself, the prospect of you're being governed, at least in part, by a government in London for which you did not vote is one that is an anathema. Second issue, as we know, we've heard a lot about, is the question of the economy. Third subject, which features as one of, I think, the three main planks in the Scottish Government's White Paper, is the claim that an independent Scotland would be a more equal Scotland. And then meanwhile, on the other side, and in part, in a sense, a kind of response to partly that debate, is an argument from the UK side that actually it's better to pool risks such as social risks, defence risks, together in a single larger state than to do so as an individual smaller state, and that in itself then also raises some questions about who in fact do we regard as being our neighbour, who do we regard as us, who are the people whom we regard as people for whom we do have some responsibility for solidarity, and where do we draw the boundary. So the economy I've talked about, in a sense I'm now trying to say, well, how far can we get at some of these other themes during the campaign and how important are they? Essentially what I'm going to do, there are really kind of two halves to this. The first is I'm going to look at what I call issues of nationhood. These are essentially those issues which basically only an independent state, or virtually always only an independent state, can actually make decisions about. I'll explain a bit more about those about tomorrow. The second is then to look at the debate about equality and welfare and how important is this. And looking in particular, first of all, at the arguments about pooling. Who do people want to pool risks and benefits with? And equally then also, is there indeed a public support for a more social democratic state if indeed Scotland were to become independent, and does that again matter in the referendum campaign? Now, what do I mean by issues of nationhood? Well, essentially it's, first of all, who's a citizen, under what conditions, who should be the head of state, what should be its defence posture, what currency should it have, what should be its broadcasting structure, what international alliances should it seek, and of course also who should have the right to come here to reside who are not currently citizens or residents. We've basically asked questions about all of these issues. There are a lot of assumptions out there among politicians of both sides about what the Scottish public think. As I said, the odd one of these has been looked at before, but we thought it would be a good idea to systematically examine what Scottish public opinion was, because the truth is, if Scotland decides to vote yes, these are issues which are a new Scottish government is going to have to decide, including in those negotiations that we were talking about just before the tea break. Okay, so I'm going to go through these one by one, very boringly, but hopefully you'll find the answers somewhat interesting. Issue number one, the passport. Now, I'm not talking about here who should be a Scottish citizen, but rather an issue that's not been much spoken about, which would clearly arise in the event of independence. And that is, okay, so you are now a British citizen, you live in Scotland, and Scotland has decided to vote yes, and we know from the White Paper that therefore you will be entitled to Scottish citizenship. What option should you have? Should you be allowed to keep your British citizenship and not take up Scottish citizenship if you want? Should you be forced to take up Scottish citizenship? Or should you be allowed to have both? And these, in the end, will actually be decisions that both sides should have. And these are the views. But basically, there is a widespread acceptance of the idea that people should be able to have both citizenships if they want. 47% support that view. Meanwhile, however, 32% of people think you should have to choose, and 17% say, hang on, you've got to be Scottish. So it's potentially a source of division within a putatively independent Scotland. It's also an issue which, to a degree, yes and no supporters have different views on. You see on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the views of yes supporters and the views of no supporters. So yes supporters, as you might imagine, are somewhat keener on the idea of, well, if you're going to stay here, mate, you've got to be Scottish. Whereas, alternatively, those on the no side are rather keener to keep up the option of being able to retain British passport and thus citizenship. So that's one subject. What about head of state? The SNP wish Scotland to continue to share a monarchy with England in the event of independence, and that indeed is the view of a majority of people in Scotland. No, it's not, and we're not the first to ever define this. Shall we say support for keeping a monarchy as opposed to Scotland having its own president is not as overwhelming as you might presume, and it certainly isn't overwhelming within those who are currently yes supporters. Actually, slightly more yes supporters would prefer to have the opportunity to vote Alex Salmond in as the first president of an independent Scotland than they would to have the prospect of King Charles III. On the other hand, of course, as we might expect, no voters overwhelmingly would like to keep the monarchy in the event that they do not want to happen of an independent Scotland. Okay, well, at least so far, as it were, on this issue, at least the stance of the SNP at least is reasonably consistent with majority opinion in Scotland, if not necessarily amongst those on their own side. What about armed forces? We said, well, hang on, what do you think should be the position on armed forces? Should an independent Scotland have its own army, navy, air force? Or should it continue to share these institutions too with the UK state? Bearing in mind that one of the arguments about an independent Scotland is, well, if we don't like where the UK is sending its army, we won't have to send ours. Well, actually, what you discover is that majority public opinion in Scotland would still like to continue to share defence forces with the rest of the UK in the event of independence, and that indeed, even amongst yes voters, public opinion on this subject is evenly divided. So, and we know from other evidence we presented in the past, the idea of Scotland having its own defence forces is probably one of the propositions about the possibility of independent Scotland that Scottish citizens find it most difficult to contemplate, even those who are supporters of independence. And that, in a sense, is underlined by this pattern of answers. Now, that said, of course, there is one area where apart from not wanting to share armed forces in general, there's certainly one thing that the current Scottish government doesn't want Scotland to continue to share, and that is Britain's nuclear weapons capability. And many a time we hear, particularly those on the yes side, claiming that a vast majority of people in Scotland do not wish to have nuclear weapons. So we thought this was such an important issue that actually we should have two bites at this cherry. So we had two goes at it. One was to ask a question about whether or not you believe that Britain should have nuclear weapons or not. So this was kind of leaving aside the issue of independence, was trying to get at people's views about the principle of a country having a nuclear weapons capability. And then secondly, we then went into the specific issue that's been a subject of the SNP and the campaign, which is whether or not an independent Scotland should say bye-bye Trident. Okay, so let's take each of those in turn. Number one, nuclear weapons. Now, my reading of other opinion polling evidence, this is pretty consistent with it. That is, yes, it is probably the case that there are more people in Scotland who do not like nuclear weapons than who do, but that the difference, the balance is not that uneven. And that indeed, interestingly, even amongst yes voters, actually only 58% of them actually say that Britain should have nuclear weapons. So it kind of is beginning to look like an issue which actually is not that big a, nuclear weapons for some people, that's why you want Scotland independence. That might be true for some activists, but this doesn't look like an issue which is a major source of division between yes and voters, and thus for the general Scottish public, as opposed to activists in the field, something which is helping to sort people into the yes and the no camp. What about getting rid of Trident? Well, here the answer is it's a 50-50 draw, but actually notice that according in this survey, even though we had a majority of people who were opposed to the principle of nuclear weapons, or at least a plurality, actually we had very slightly more people who said, no, actually, we should allow the Trident subs to stay, then we should make them go. But again, notice quite remarkably that, yes, there's a bit of a difference between the two sides in this subject, but this is not apparently a major source of division. So here is again something which the politicians talk about, the campaigners talk about, they feel very strongly about, but actually it's not clear that this is a significant issue so far as voters making their decisions is concerned. Next one you've heard already about quite a bit in the press if you've been following any of the coverage of the last 24 hours. Surprise, surprise. Yes, most people in Scotland would like to keep the pound. Here the SNP have undoubtedly got the right policies as far as public opinion is concerned. There are some people on the yes side who are not too keen on the idea, so support amongst the yes side for the idea of keeping the pound is not so great. But again, the principle of having the currency is clearly not a source of division. What, of course, you might think is true, however, is that the issue of whether or not it would actually happen would be a source of division. And it's certainly true is that there is quite widespread skepticism about whether or not it would actually happen. Only 57% of people actually think that Scotland would be able to use the pound, and 28% of people would like Scotland to be able to use the pound, but don't expect it to happen. However, there isn't that much difference between yes and no voters in their degree of skepticism about whether the currency would actually happen. What you find is that, yes, it's true that about 39% of no voters who would like to keep the pound are doubtful about what it would happen, and you therefore might think, well, maybe indeed all that talk has kind of put them off the idea of independence. But there are 33% of people amongst yes voters who would like the pound, who don't think it's going to happen. So it's not clear at all that it may well be that for some people, the prospect of George Osborne saying, no, you can't have it, is actually a good reason for voting for independence, as opposed to being put off. But anyway, this seems to be one area where Project Fear, as it's been dubbed by the yes side, doesn't seem to have much traction. What about the BBC? What about broadcasting? So we said to people, okay, so what should be happening in independent Scotland? Should people continue to be able to simply to have the BBC on the same terms and conditions as they have them now, which implies paying a licence fee, etc., etc.? Should it be possible? Should we have both the BBC and the Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, or should we just have a Scottish Broadcasting Corporation? The good news for you, Brian, is that virtually nobody wishes to get rid of you. Even on the yes side, virtually only 1 in 5 of them would like to expunge you from their television screens. And indeed, actually, it looks as though quite a lot of people would be quite happy just to carry on with the BBC and are not entirely clear that they want their own Scottish Broadcasting Council. And to that extent, at least, the yes side's proposition is not so popular as one might think. What about Europe? I mean, you've already heard a lot of people saying Europe doesn't matter. Well, let me just kind of add a little bit more detail onto that. Lots of discussion, lots of presumption on this, that because Scotland's political class are like Europe, because Nigel Farage doesn't have much traction up here, ergo Scotland is a much more Europhile country than England and could not possibly be dragged in the direction of having doubts about Europe by such commentary as they've heard south of the border. Well, we have to admit it's 8 years since we bothered to ask a question about Europe, but we kind of finally realised the error of our ways. So all of these early readings are kind of for the early part of the 21st century. And this is actually a 5-point question which I've collapsed, and the blue line is the one that's irrelevant. So here are people who say that either they think, and again the question is about Britain, so it's trying to get at the principle of whether or not people want to be inside the EU. And we say to people, should Britain, so one option is Britain should leave the EU, and another option is, well, Britain should stay in the EU, but it should try to reduce its powers. And I'm just classifying those two groups as the Eurosceptics, all right? And as you can see, I mean, actually even in the early years of the 21st century, between 40 and 48% of people were kind of choosing one of those two options, but it's now 60%. Just as the rest of the UK has become more Eurosceptic over the last decade or so, so also has Scotland. So therefore, as it were, the idea that an independent Scotland may not necessarily have a 100% guarantee about its European Union membership, given that backdrop, doesn't exactly strike one as the world's most central proposition. People might be kind of slightly upset if they weren't inside the EU, but they're not exactly dying to want to stay in there. And indeed, what you discover is that actually when you ask people about what should be the position for Scotland, yes and no voters are virtually identical in their views as to whether or not Scotland should be inside the European Union. Finally, migration. Now, what we chose to do here was to get at it by asking some questions we've asked previously for a rather different purpose. And they're very much about the degree to which people think that more migration of different forms will be a threat to Scotland's cultural identity. Now, that obviously is only one side of the immigration argument, but perhaps we might think it's the one that's more relevant to a debate about independence. And we asked that question essentially separately about Muslims, people from Eastern Europe, and from people from Black and Asian backgrounds. And as you can see on each of them, just under a half or so of people in Scotland say they agree with the proposition that more people of these various kinds coming to Scotland could be a threat to Scotland's sense of identity, rather less being disagreeing with the proposition. So, as it were, not entirely clear that an independent Scotland would necessarily have that much freedom of manoeuvre vis-à-vis having higher levels of migration, at least so far as public opinion is concerned. But again, note, this is not an issue that divides yes and no voters. Yes voters are not keener on opening Scotland's doors to the rest of the world, as are no voters, so again, not apparently crucial. So what you can then discover, of course, you can take this stuff and you can then put it into the same statistical sausage machines I was using this morning, seeing whether any of this matters. And the answer is a little bit, not a great deal, but I mean, one or two of them. Actually, the idea of whether you want a president rather than a queen seems to make a bit of a difference. The currency makes a very small difference. Whether or not, that small group of people who want to get rid of the BBC are very clearly nationalist, and that therefore actually kicks into this equation, as does the issue of armed forces. But the truth is, these all come towards the bottom of my list, and they're not that important. And notice, nuclear weapons doesn't make it at all. Europe doesn't make it at all. Okay. Second area, well, then equality and welfare, and in particular, first of all, looking at the question of pooling. And I should say here straight away, this is something that Lindsay Patterson in particular encouraged us to get into. And what we wanted to get at was, okay, who do you think, for example, the revenues from North Sea oil, where should they go? Should they simply be used to pay for services and benefits in Scotland, or should they indeed be shared with the rest of the UK? Equally, so where should the revenues come from for the benefits that are paid in Scotland? Should they be paid out of simply revenues raised in Scotland? Or should they come from the UK as a whole? Now, as you might guess, the answer to those two questions is not exactly the same, but I suspect even so, the answers may to some degree surprise you. So yes, it is true that Scots are a little bit keener on the idea of confining the revenues of taxes to themselves than they are on the idea of having to rely on their own resources in order to pay for benefits. That said, however, even on what you might regard, given the history of the last 40 years, of the touchstone issue of it's Scotland's oil, well, apparently only around half of people in Scotland agree that it's only Scotland's oil. Meanwhile, notice that when it comes to the issue of paying benefits, one of the things that the No side has been talking about, actually there's a clear majority who prefer to have pooling. And here, however, this is a subject on which opinion does divide yes and no voters. If you are a yes voter, you think the revenues certainly are Scotland's, and you're inclined to say the benefits should be paid out of Scottish taxes. If you are a no voter, you are quite clearly of the opposite view. So this is a debate that does seem to matter. Who is my neighbour? Who I have solidarity with? Either because you actually feel some moral sense of solidarity, or because maybe you think it's pragmatically in Scotland's interest to have one answer than the other. That does make a difference. And indeed, when we look at the difference between people's votes, as you can see, yes voters are much more likely to say it should be Scotland only than they are the UK as a whole. So, what happens when we invite this to go into the statistical source machine? The answer is, it goes in, it almost tops my champion, independence, the impact of independence on the economy. Pensions happens to be selected. If you say you can't have pensions, then benefits immediately takes its place. So clearly the issue of pooling risk seems to matter. Now, of course, my view then, of course, is, well, so yes, indeed, it's another aspect of the economic and the financial debate, albeit one with a moral element to it, rather than not being economics. But so far as welfare is concerned, this theme of who is my neighbour, who I should share risk with, is something that does seem to be central to the debate, and it's important to the way in which voters are making decisions. What, however, about the other aspect of the welfare debate, which is Scotland wants more of it, it regards it as a way of achieving a more equal society. There's lots of data in the survey about this. Let me just give you a little taster. This is simply a question in which people are asked, should there be more or less government spending on benefits of people with disabilities who can't work, retired people, and those who are unemployed? The first two are deserving categories, and nobody wishes to take away the bus pass that I recently became eligible for, having just passed 60, for which I am duly grateful. On the other hand, the unemployed, no, Scotland doesn't necessarily want to spend more money on the unemployed, and in that is arguably not that dissimilar from England. Indeed, Scotland's attitudes towards paying benefits to those who are unemployed have become markedly harsher in recent years. It's now the case that 52% of people in Scotland choose the proposition unemployment benefit is too high and helps to stop and puts some people off finding work, as opposed to the proposition that unemployment is too low and it's therefore all jolly unfair. It's been moving in that direction for quite a while. It's moved further, and in that respect, it is showing much the same trend that previous British social attitude surveys have shown has been going on south of the border as well. So the idea that therefore that Scotland is a society that's necessarily, in all respects at least, wanting to spend a great deal of money more on welfare is something that we should not necessarily take at face value. Equally, and this is just a general question about whether or not the government should spend more should increase taxes and spend more on health, education and social services, and then there are options about keeping the same and reducing it. I'm just focusing on the more here. And again, a lot of the discourse we're hearing is about, well, actually, Scotland wants to have a bigger state than does England, and that ergo is what would follow from independence. Well, actually, as you can see, much as true as across the UK as a whole, support for the idea of wanting to spend more has declined in recent years, in part, almost undoubtedly, at least, as a reaction to the fact that spending did go up rather a lot under the last UK government. But notice, perhaps even more interestingly, that despite the fact that we've now been in the age of austerity for a while, albeit people like John McLaren tell us we ain't seen the worst of it yet, there isn't as yet any dramatic increase in a wish to increase spending. So again, Scotland is not that evidently as a tax and spend nation as we might imagine. But then again, what's interesting is that, again, is it the case that this welfare debate, this demand for more equality, is something that's motivating voters? Well, one of the things you may not have noticed in my first talk is that we did have a proposition. Do you think independence is going to result in more equality or less or not? And only 16% of people actually think that independence would reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. And people's views on that subject just don't correlate terribly well at all with whether or not they're for or against independence. Equally, what we discover here is that, yes, it is true that yes voters are a bit more pro-welfare on all of these various measures than are no voters. But again, these are pretty small differences. Differences such that one might want to say, well, actually, probably they are slightly more in favour of welfare because of the kind of people they are, rather than necessarily because of being in favour of independence. Now, that said, there is one very small instance where I did actually manage to find something. So in the grounds of being totally transparent, there was one very small area where attitudes towards welfare do actually seem to be strikingly different once we put things through the statistical source machine. And that is, there is a small group of people in Scotland who actually strongly disagree with a proposition that says that large numbers of people these days falsely claim benefits. So we might regard these people as they're kind of really welfare friendly. They just don't buy into the narrative that there is a lot of waste out there. And as it happens, yes voters are twice as likely to strongly disagree with that proposition as no voters. And although that difference might sound small, because we're at the kind of bottom end of the spectrum, that actually is just about something that makes it into the statistical sources machine. So there is a little bit of a difference, but just remember it's a very small group. So as a result, what you therefore find is that although that little item manages to appear into my statistical sources machine, nothing else about welfare makes it at all. What does then actually emerge is that actually when you've gone through all this stuff, the one issue about issue of nationhood that most clearly emerges consistently, however you model the data, as being something that matters is whether or not you want to keep the BBC or not. Brian, you are the most contentious institution in Scotland, if not necessarily the least popular. Essentially what's going on here, there is a relatively small group of people in Scotland who do not want to have the BBC, who probably regard it as an institution that does not adequately reflect the distinctive culture of Scotland as they perceive it. And for that group of people are very clearly nationalists. And here, for them at least, there is a strong cultural reason for voting yes. But it's a relatively small section of the Scottish population for whom this proves to be important. Okay, so what do we discover? Well, looking at these issues of nationhood helps a little to identify a group with a distinctively strong belief in Scottish self-government, that idea that Scotland should be governing itself, that Scotland has a distinctive culture which should be reflected, but it's marginal and it can quite rapidly disappear once we introduce other things. Secondly, a lot of those debates, we've talked about the currency, we've talked about the European Union today, lots of people have accepted this is not really going anywhere. The truth is that the nuclear weapons debate is not going anywhere very much either. What does matter is what Lindsay Patterson said to us would matter, which is whether or not you think that risk should be pooled. Though arguably this is simply another embellishment on the general debate about the economic and financial consequences of independence rather than necessarily a new dimension. But that otherwise issues of welfare about just simply whether you want more or less, whether Scotland would, therefore, as a result, be a more or less equal society, again, doesn't seem to be a major issue of traction in this referendum campaign. So I hope if this morning was all bleeding obvious, that this afternoon, at least one thing that I said is perhaps something you would not necessarily have expected. Some of you may wish to disagree with, but that's our best understanding of actually where Scottish public opinion seems to be on some of these issues that are prominent in the campaign, but many of which actually don't seem to be working out there.